There are certain mornings in Oxford when the air arrives softened, as though the city has forgotten itself, when bells sound less like announcements and more like memories. This was one of those mornings. A weak, unambitious sun filtered through the tracery of my blinds, and the sheets clung with the sour aftertaste of last night's Glenlivet. I lay still. Houseman lay open beside me. The loveliest of trees, the cherry now, though I had reached only as far as the third line before my concentration dissolved into the slow throb behind my eyes. The telephone rang, as if it too regretted the intrusion. Strange's voice lacked its usual obligation to formality. There's something odd at St. Etheldrada's. Morse. Probably nothing, but I've told them you'll look in. You like a morning among the dawns, don't you? It wasn't the first time he'd dispatched me not toward blood or gunmetal, but toward an atmosphere. And it was, truthfully, the only kind of crime I still had patience for, the ones that began not with a scream, but with something slightly misplaced. By the time I arrived, the porter, a white-haired man with the uneasy stillness of those who never feel quite at home in their own uniform, had already shown Louis the scarf. It was a soft, powder-blue thing, abandoned on the top stair, leading to the fellows' rooms. No name, no perfume, no snag in the wool, just neatly folded, as if its owner had paused to remove it deliberately before walking away from herself. She could have dropped it, I said. Louis, always direct, frowned. But folded, sir. We stood in the stairwell a moment longer than necessary. The silence of the college was not silent at all, but full of murmured arguments from distant seminar rooms, the squeak of a mop in the cloisters, the tired rustle of old leather bindings being consulted for new theses. Still, it felt untouched, curated. It was Oxford at its most impenetrably serene, and therefore at its most suspicious. In the senior common room, the porter gestured toward the low mahogany table between two worn armchairs. The ashtray, a heavy, absurdly ornamental thing, made of greenish cut glass, was brimming with menthol cigarette stubs, crushed with methodical irritation. 11 in total, all smoked down to nearly identical lengths. None of the fellows smoke, the porter had muttered. College policy forbids it indoors, always has. I ran a finger along the rim of the ashtray. No smears of lipstick, no scent of pipe tobacco, just the faint, medicinal ghost of menthol. The smell seemed incompatible with the velvet hush of the SECR, like a radio left on in a cathedral. Greaves doesn't smoke? I asked. The porter looked offended. Dr. Greaves has asthma, sir. I said nothing. It wasn't a question of health. Men with asthma have always found ways to sin. It was something else, something in the symmetry of the cigarette butts, and the absence of ash elsewhere. Not on the armrests, not on the hearth, not on the hearth, not on the hearth, not on the Persian rug. It was performative, a little stage left behind by someone who believed they would not be noticed. Or rather by someone who believed they would. Louis, in the doorway, cleared his throat. Groundskeeper says he found a scarf earlier. Same color, in the wisteria near the back wall. So it had moved. Or there were two. Or someone was in the habit of misplacing powder blue wool. I nodded and left the room without touching anything further. Outside, Owen Rouse stood quietly in the sunlight, pruning a wayward vine from the old brickwork. He did not glance up when I approached, but addressed me as if he had sensed me long before I arrived. Nothing wrong with the flowers, he said. It's always the people. You found a scarf. Aye, in the garden bed. Someone had walked through in heels, left a bit of mud, kicked up. Not the sort of thing students wear anymore. She could have been. Rouse turned then, looking not at me but toward the roofline of the chapel. The wisteria, recently trimmed, exhaled the scent of something living and a little overgrown. I thought again of the scarf, its tidy fold on the stair, and the menthol cigarettes smoldering invisibly in the ashtray. It was almost nothing. Almost. But as I walked back through the quad, the wind turned slightly, and brought with it the unmistakable chill of the chairwell, the kind of cold that doesn't arrive unless something has entered the water. A disturbance had begun. Not loud, Not obvious, but I could feel it. As certain as a misquoted poem, or the faint click of a key turning where it shouldn't. And so the case began, not with a body, but with the knowledge that someone had wanted to be found, or forgotten, in exactly the right way. There is a certain kind of death that attempts to tidy itself. Margaret Clennell's, I was told, had all the hallmarks of restraint. No bruising, no blood, just the symmetry of her shoes, placed side by side like punctuation, and the quiet, indecipherable presence of the river that had taken her in. Lewis had relayed the details over the phone while I stirred a lukewarm second cup of coffee. A cleaner, early 50s, worked part-time at St. Etheldreda's. Body recovered just past Magdalen Bridge, caught gently in the weeds. No note, no witnesses. The scarf was the only bridge between her and the college, a pale strand of wool woven through ivy and the architecture of silence. I walked the river path alone that morning, letting the cold breath of the Cherwell brush at the ankles of my coat. The shoes were already bagged by forensics, but I'd seen the photographs. Patent leather, cheap, but spotless. Set apart just enough to suggest composure, but not ritual. She had removed them, not discarded them. That was important. Or it wanted to be. It was Hardy, I think, who once wrote of the arrangement of endings. He understood that grief leaves its own choreography. Margaret, if she had stepped into the water of her own volition, had done so with a kind of grace, but grace, in my experience, is rarely spontaneous. Dr. Charles Greaves lived in Stairwell B, the part of the college that smelled eternally of damp stone and neglect. His rooms were orderly, in the way old things become once they've been left alone too long. Not quite dusty, but absent of fingerprints. He answered the door in a cardigan the color of old book bindings, and led me in without curiosity. "You were familiar with Miss Clennon?" I asked eventually. He considered the word. Familiar? No. She was a cleaner, efficient, unremarkable. He said it with the faintest trace of boredom. Unremarkable. As though saying it twice would make it true. "You smoke, Dr. Greaves?" He turned, slowly, as if I'd asked him whether he believed in angels. "Certainly not. Asthmatic, since prep school." "Why?" I moved toward the sideboard. It was lined with ashtrays, 12 of them, perhaps more, arranged with the fastidiousness of someone who collects without sentiment. Porcelain, cut glass, brass. One bore the crest of Balliol. Another looked stolen from a cafe in Paris. None had seen use. I checked. "You have rather a collection," I said almost to myself. "They're relics," he replied. "From another world." I nodded. Sometimes people say more when they think they're only commenting on objects. Did Margaret ever clean in here? Of course. Thursday mornings. Polite, punctual, silent. Not silent enough, I thought. There were no photographs in the room, no clutter, no lingering warmth, just the gentle claustrophobia of bookshelves and the hushed suspicion of a man who had perfected the art of erasure. I asked whether she'd ever seemed troubled. He paused. I'd expected the usual platitudes. She kept to herself. Or we weren't close. But instead he walked to the window and stood there, looking out over the quad. A pale blue scarf caught in the hedge, motionless in the breeze. She once asked me about a line from Chaka. That was odd. Cleaners don't usually concern themselves with Middle English. What was the line? He hesitated, as if the memory had been buried with effort. "The life so short, the craft so long to learn." The words were spoken with the affection of a man who understood things too late. When I left, the sun had dropped slightly, and the quad had taken on its usual late afternoon hush. The scarf in the hedge had gone. Back in my rooms I opened the crossword from yesterday, unfinished and folded. Clue 17 down. Ordered departure. 6 letters. I filled it in now. Almost instinctively. Retire. A word too passive, I thought, for a woman like Margaret Clennell, who had asked, after Chaucer, who had folded her shoes beside the river as if she'd once learned how to leave politely, and perhaps been taught in Oxford, that departure must always look like choice. Dr. Helena Vale, occupied an office that smelled faintly of beeswax and aged lilac, the sort of scent that belongs more to memory than matter. Sunlight, filtered through a panel of warped leaded glass, pooled languidly across a clutter of annotated texts and a vase of tulips long past their prime. She rose as we entered, though the gesture felt less like welcome and more like choreography. I'd heard of her, of course. Her lectures on Sappho were said to be electric. Though never theatrical, students spoke of her voice with the reverence usually reserved for cello music and distant mothers. She gestured to the chairs, mismatched and softly unraveling at the arms. Lewis perched dutifully. I remained standing, studying the spines of Greek anthologies along the far wall. "I understand you worked with Margaret Clennell." I asked. "Worked with?" "No. She was a cleaner." Occasionally we exchanged a few words, pleasant enough. Her diction was sanded smooth, every syllable considered. It wasn't the kind of evasiveness that hoped to conceal. It was the kind that believed concealment was a form of mercy. "Pleasant enough," I repeated. She blinked, the kind of blink that came with internal editing. She once brought me a page, something she said she'd found in the library, torn from a very old book. It contained a translation of Sappho, fragment 31, I believe. I waited. She didn't elaborate, so I did. "That's the one about envy and desire." She tilted her head. "Is it?" "It is." I murmured the line almost idly. "He seems to me equal to God's that man who sits opposite you." The rest I left unspoken. Sometimes meaning requires its own silence. She gave a slight smile, almost fond. Margaret was curious in her own way, but not scholarly. I believe she found the page and thought it poetic, symbolic, perhaps. Of what? She looked at me then, properly, for the first time. A slow, unsettling gaze, as if she were trying to decide whether I'd ever been in love. "It was old," she said simply, "and torn." Margaret liked things that had survived, and did she survive? Vale's gaze dropped to her hands. I noticed the slight tremor in the left, quickly stilled beneath the right. I don't know what Margaret endured, Inspector, or how much of it she chose. There was something unfinished in that sentence. I let it linger. Outside, Lewis was waiting, notebook closed, mind ticking in its square, practical fashion. He spoke without looking up. "Margaret's flat's empty. Nothing disturbed. Everything folded. Cupboards bare. Rent's been paid through next month, though. In cash. Paid by anonymous deposit at a post office," he said. "But someone cared enough to keep her housed." I nodded. A woman without family, living with the grace of someone who expected to be unseen, and yet her rent was quietly covered. That didn't sound like abandonment. It sounded like debt, or penance. Back in my own rooms, I found the poem in the old Penguin volume I kept for quiet despair. "When I look at you, even speech fails me. My tongue breaks, and a thin flame runs under my skin." Sappho had never been uncertain about the intensity of absence. Margaret had found that page. Margaret, with her patent shoes and her discarded scarf and her questions about Choxa. She had read that fragment and kept it. Not because she was a romantic, but because she knew it meant something she couldn't say aloud. And somewhere beneath the polished restraint of Helena Vale and the carved reticence of Charles Greaves, that silence had thickened, until it became a weight one might finally lay down by the water. The senior common room at St. Etheldreda's had a hush particular to Oxford evenings. Not silence, precisely, but the hum of cloistered minds exhaling their day's thoughts into port and polite irrelevance. The curtains were drawn. The decanter passed, and conversation unfolded like chess, slow, ritualized, faintly cruel. I let them speak. There was mention of a plagiarism inquiry. Recent. A second-year English student had submitted an essay on Milton's Fallen Angels that bore a remarkable resemblance to a thesis written a decade earlier, a thesis which had, in fact, never been submitted, its author having been expelled just days before his viva. "Aaron Lister," someone said. "I remember him. Clever boy. Trouble with boundaries. Dr. Greaves shifted in his chair. The glass in his hand trembled, almost imperceptibly, against the rim. He was unstable, he said. A fantasist. Should never have been admitted. I watched the port in my glass swirl to a small crimson stillness. The thing about liars, I've found, is that they talk in absolutes. Truth, like wine, tends to breathe a little. I excused myself shortly after, the room already soft with fatigue and overcooked civility. Outside, the night had turned brisk. The moon glared down with a kind of clinical detachment, as though it too disapproved of the company. Back in my flat, I spread the autopsy report across the table. It smelled faintly of old ink and toner. Institutional paper always does, Margaret Clennell. No signs of violence, no alcohol, no toxins, and no trace of nicotine. But those cigarettes had been smoked. All 11 of them stubbed with identical pressure, the filters crushed with care. Menthols. Not the sort of choice you make casually. I'd seen the ashtray again, just before dinner, still in situ, untouched, like a question left hanging for someone else to answer. I considered the possibility that Margaret had been pretending, that she'd staged a scene, the scarf, the shoes, the ashtray, in some private theater of resignation, but it didn't sit right. People with dentures do not smoke menthol. They certainly don't leave 11 smoldering offerings without inhaling. And yet no one in that building claimed them. None of the dons smoked. College policy forbade it. Greaves had asthma, Vale had self-control, and the others, well, they would have offered the lie too eagerly. A smoker always wants to confess. Eventually, my crossword lay folded by the lamp, neglected. I opened it, searching for something unrelated to death. Clue 9 down. Smoke without fire. I stared at it far longer than necessary. I thought of Margaret's scarf, her shoes, her quiet questions about poetry. I thought of the fragment of Sappho, torn from a forgotten book. I thought of Aaron Lister, a name dropped like glass in the middle of Greaves' calm. The crossword clue remained blank. It was too neat, too clever. It didn't want to be solved. Not yet. I poured another measure. The liquid moved the way grief does, slow, insistent, without apology. People don't drown in rivers like the Cherwell by accident. They arrive there by footsteps, by whispers, by the slow erosion of usefulness. Margaret had been erased long before she entered the water. The death only made it final. Outside, someone walked across the quad, heels on stone, fading. I listened, not because I expected significance, but because I have learned that most revelations sound like something ordinary, until it's too late. The ashtray remained full. 11 cigarettes. No fire, just smoke. It was Lewis who found the photograph. Not through cunning, but through patience. The kind of diligence that can still outstrip genius when the corridors are long enough and the archives cold. He'd been in the basement of the college library, sifting through faculty rosters and committee minutes, when he found it nestled in a manila folder marked Summer Gaudy 1978. No red ink, no stamps, just a photograph, black and white, faded at the corners. He slid it across my desk like a playing card. Thought you'd want to see this, sir. The image was wide, slightly tilted. A college dinner in the great hall. Gowns, candlesticks, silver that hadn't yet dulled with the 1980s. In the foreground, I saw Greaves. Younger, leaner, wearing the kind of expression reserved for men who've already decided the rest of the table is beneath them. His hand, casually, perhaps unconsciously, rested on the shoulder of a young woman seated to his right. She wasn't smiling, she was looking past the camera, eyes caught on something just out of frame. Helena Vale. In the blurred margins of the photograph, behind the second row of tables, there was another figure, half-shadowed, holding a serving tray. Head turned slightly, mid-motion. Margaret. Not older, not diminished, not in uniform. She wore a dark dress, simple and clean, and though the photograph couldn't speak, I could almost hear her humming something softly as she walked, something that didn't belong to the moment, and therefore outlived it. She wasn't a cleaner then. She was part of the machinery, perhaps invisible, but not peripheral. So what happened in the years between? What could strip a woman of her name, her place, her history? I showed Louis. He squinted. She looks different. Sharper, confident. People are rarely born invisible, I said. It's usually learned. That afternoon, I spoke to one of the janitors. Old chap with a limp, smelled faintly of bleach and barley sugar. We were standing beneath the cloister arch, where the light never fully reaches. She used to hume while she cleaned. He said, proper stuff too. Puccini. Not pop. Did you ever ask her about it? He shrugged. She said she used to sing a bit when she was young, said it kept the silence from getting too big. Later, in my rooms, I studied the photograph again. Not the figures, but the negative space. The way Margaret leaned just slightly to her right, as though listening. The way Vale's hands were clenched beneath the table. The way Greaves looked, not at the camera, but at the girl beside him, as if the lens were an afterthought. It struck me then that the past rarely vanishes. It simply dims until only a few know where to look for it. And Margaret, for all her silence, for all her folded scarves and absent teeth, had remembered. She had seen something. The question was whether she had lived with it quietly, or whether she had begun finally to speak. I poured myself a drink and left the photograph by the window. Outside, the last of the afternoon light spilled across the quad like oil, thick and reluctant. The tulips in Vale's window were gone. In their place, a single book left open, fluttering faintly in the breeze. Somewhere, someone was beginning to forget, and somewhere else, something remembered too well. The answers, I suspected, lay not in what Margaret had done, but in what had been done to her, and how long those doing it had expected her to remain grateful. The photograph said enough. Not everything, but enough. The rest, as always, was in the margins. It was Louis who spotted it first. The name, half smudged in the brittle college guest ledger, beneath a column titled Temporary Residence, Stairwell E. A. Lister. Room 9. 2 nights. No forwarding address. The entry meant little by itself. But names, like ashes, have a habit of clinging to the fabric of things. The porter remembered him, vaguely. Most porters do, memory being a professional liability rather than an asset. But this one blinked twice, and muttered nervous sort. Kept looking over his shoulder, smelled like paint thinner. Not aftershave. Actual thinner. Was he alone? I asked. He nodded. But I've known men who could commit entire crimes just by standing still. Cowley was grey that afternoon, a kind of deliberate grey, as though the light had agreed not to interfere. The address, registered under Aaron Lister's name, was a converted bed-sit above a fish and chip shop, the stairwell too narrow for regret, and the banister sticky with something time had given up trying to name. The flat was small, 1 room, 1 sink, and a curtain pretending to be a wall. The bed was unmade in the precise way that suggested someone had never learned to make it. On the table lay fragments, scraps of verse clipped from library journals, a dog-eared copy of Eliot annotated to within an inch of its breadth, and a manuscript held together by a binder clip that had rusted slightly at the edges. The thesis title, barely legible under the scroll, Between Fire and Silence. Fragmentation in Lyric Devotion from Sappho to Pound. I flipped through it without comment. Half of it was underlined in red biro, some of it Margaret's hand. If I had to guess, the rest was a lament, overexposed brilliance, drowning in academic debris. Louis called me over to the desk drawer. He didn't speak. He simply lifted something out and placed it in my hand. A tin. Small, rectangular, dull metal with flaking red paint. The word Margaret scratched lightly into the lid. Locked. And on the floor near the waste bin, an empty menthol cigarette packet. Louis looked at me. He smoked them. Apparently. I turned the tin over in my palm. It had the chill of something that had once been warm. You think he killed her? Louis asked. Finally. I said nothing. The problem with people like Aaron Lister is that they remain just close enough to brilliance that failure feels like a betrayal, and betrayal when misread becomes fuel. I remembered Greaves's face when the name was spoken in the SER, a muscle clenching too quickly to be involuntary. Lister had known Margaret. Of that I was sure. The locked tin, the notes, the thesis. Too much affection laced through the wreckage, but affection curdled fast in Oxford, especially among the forgotten. And yet, something was off. The cigarettes for one. Lister smoked them, yes. But the ashtray in the SER, 11 stubs, crushed precisely, left like breadcrumbs. Too careful. Too symmetrical. Lister struck me as many things, but not careful. He was being watched. Or worse, imitated. Someone had used his presence like a fingerprint. Left behind, deliberately. I put the tin in my coat. We would open it later. For now, I stood at the window, watching Cowley breathe. The street below pulsed with the exhausted rhythm of end-of-day traffic. In the alley beside the shop, a fox moved briefly, and then was gone. Lister may have wanted Margaret silenced, but wanting and doing are rarely the same. Especially here, where truth often arrives, dressed in the voice of someone else. Eleanor Clennell lived in a low bungalow just beyond the bypass, where hedges grew in silence and grief lived like wallpaper, always there, rarely remarked upon. She answered the door, as if she had already refused to a small woman in a hand-knitted cardigan. Her voice clipped, her eyes wary. I introduced myself. She didn't offer tea, but she let me in, and in Oxford that's something. I told her about the circumstances, the scarf, the river, the cigarettes. She said very little, her mouth pressed into the sort of line people wear when the world has already tried to explain itself too many times. Margaret wasn't mad, if that's what they're saying. She was careful. I told her I wasn't here to judge madness. She sat, finally, in an armchair with frayed arms and nodded once. She had a lover once, back in the 80s, one of the Dons. Senior. Clever. Cold. Something happened, no one told me what. But she left, quietly. Everything she had. Job, accommodation, pension, reputation, all of it just stopped. Dismissed. No official record, Eleanor said. Just gone. And she came back? Under a different name. Kept her head down. Did what was needed. Always the practical one, my sister. But there were days she'd hum to herself like she was someone else. She reached into a drawer. I didn't ask how she knew what I'd come for. Some women just know the shape of things. She handed me a letter, yellowed at the edges, never sealed. Addressed to CV, in ink that trembled only slightly. I read it in silence. Not quite confession. Not quite accusation. It was the voice of someone speaking into a room they didn't expect to be answered from. Lines like the fire you lit, left no smoke. Only ash that would not scatter, and I remained, not for forgiveness but to see whether absence could unlearn pain. It was literary. Clipped. But the wound beneath it pulsed. CV, Charles Valentine. Grieve. Eleanor watched me. Carefully. She still had feelings for him, I think. Not love, but something like it. The echo of a thing too heavy to carry, but too real to drop. You knew she was back at St. Eteldrada's. I suspected. We didn't speak much. She wrote, now and then, usually to say she'd renewed her library card. I left quietly. The bursar met me later that afternoon, a pinched man with a stammer that hid behind numbers. He showed me the documentation. 3 weeks prior, Margaret had updated her will. One change. The beneficiary, Aaron Lister. No known relation. No explanation given. Just his name, typed cleanly and without embellishment. I asked the bursar if she had mentioned him. Not once. She signed the form, refused a witness, and walked out. Outside, the rain had begun again. Not heavy but persistent. The kind of rain that turns thought into fog. Lister. Margaret. Greaves. A past too carefully buried. now clawing its way up through the paper and ivy. I returned home and placed the letter beside the tin marked Margaret, both unopened, both burning faintly through their seals. Some betrayals don't kill the body, they kill the name. Margaret Clennell had disappeared twice, once when they asked her to, and once when no one noticed she had come back. But she hadn't forgotten, and somewhere between that letter and that will was the shape of the question she died asking. I just hadn't yet learned how to hear it. There are certain books in Oxford which don't belong on shelves. They haunt them, misplaced, misfiled, and misremembered, like guests who never quite left the dinner. The Sappho fragment had been one such volume. I sat in the library, long after the students had disappeared into their own myth, rereading the page Margaret had once found folded among the wrong centuries. Its parchment was dry, the ink delicate, a single torn leaf, almost certainly from the college's missing edition of Lyric Voices from Lesbos. Sappho. Translated poorly in the printed text, but beneath it in Margaret's hand, a second voice ran like an undertow in the margins. Tearful, sorrowful, intimate. You may forget the sound of the sea, but not the salt. And further down, beside a fragment about hidden desire, even the moon pities us. I hadn't thought Margaret capable of such subtlety. But then, I hadn't really thought of her at all, not before the river. That I think was my mistake. One of many. I asked for Dr. Vale. She received me in her rooms, the curtains drawn against the soft glare of a cloudy Oxford noon. The air smelled faintly of violet talc and yesterday's books. I held the page without accusation. You said she found it misfiled. Yes. In a return slot. Under S for Spencer. An accident? Maybe. Or a message. Did she copy the translation? Helena took a long time to answer. She had a gift. Language came easily to her, in ways it often doesn't for those with too much of it. Did she mean Margaret? Or herself? The grammar remained beautifully evasive. Did she ever speak to you about Sappho? Once. Long ago, she asked if the poet had ever been happy. I said poetry isn't interested in happiness, only the lack of it. She smiled then. Not out of joy, but memory. The marginalia were not meant for publication. I nodded. We both made mistakes, she said. Charles more than most. It was her use of the past tense that caught me. A slip or something quieter. You loved him? A pause. I admired him. That's not the same thing. And we were all younger than we should have been. She turned her gaze to the window, though the curtains hadn't moved. She blamed me for what happened to Margaret. She thought I knew, but we never said it aloud. That was Oxford's gift. Everything unsaid, preserved forever. I stood to leave. Helena's hands were folded neatly in her lap, like a sentence waiting for its final clause. In the courtyard, a solitary ash tree had begun to shed its leaves. Pale and crisp, they floated downward in slow spirals, making no sound as they landed. It was a small thing, an echo. But the word ashtray sounded different in my mind now. Not just an object, not just stubs of smoke and silence, but ash, and trace, and remains. Ashes from fire, traces from life, remains from love. I looked up at the grey windows of St. Etheldreda's, and for the first time since the scarf on the staircase, I felt the case begin to breathe its own story. Margaret had been silenced once. Not for her sins, but for witnessing others. And now, the silence was fraying. In her margins, in poetry, in ash, in memory, she had written herself back into the world. Someone had tried to erase her. But she had left traces. I just needed to read between them. He arrived with the wet hem of his coat dragging autumn behind him. Aaron Lister, gaunt, blinking too often, the kind of man whose shoulders had forgotten the shape of peace. The porter called up to Lewis, and Lewis called me, and by the time I stepped into the small room off the quad, Lister was already confessing in halting, trembling phrases. I killed her, he said. I pushed her into the river. She said she'd tell about Charles and Helena, about what they did to her. He kept his hands folded, not in remorse, in rehearsal. Lewis offered him tea. He declined, but reached for the chipped mug anyway, hands shaking just enough to make you watch. It had the rhythm of sincerity. The little cracks, the faltering breath. The story was almost too human to be doubted. But I did. Immediately. "Tell me about the scarf," I said. He paused, swallowed. "She dropped it, on the stairs. I picked it up, left it in the room where the ashtray was." "Ah!" I let him continue. He spoke of arguments and recriminations. Margaret had threatened to go to the newspapers. She still had the torn manuscript, he said, the page that could prove Helena had plagiarized an unpublished thesis. She wanted money, or justice, or revenge. His voice broke on that last word. A calculated fracture. He claimed he'd followed her to the riverbank, that they'd argued, that she slipped, that he didn't help her up. So, it was an accident. Yes, but I didn't stop it. So it's the same thing. No, I said quietly. It isn't. Lewis looked across at me, frowning. I could feel the question gathering behind his eyes. Lister rubbed his sleeve. A man, trying to erase himself. "Where did she fall?" I asked. "Near the bend, by the reeds, past the footbridge." But the autopsy showed water in the lungs, consistent with a deeper patch before the bend. A small error, perhaps, but not one a guilty man is likely to make. And the scarf found in the senior common room, not on the stairs. The only people who knew that detail were myself, Lewis, the porter. "Well, who told you about the scarf, Mr. Lister?" He blinked, looked to the floor. It must have been, I assume." "No, you didn't," Lewis finally asked, softly. "Then who filled the ashtray?" I answered without looking at either of them. "No one." There was silence. Only the faint scrape of the wind against the old glass. It was the crossword clue that had returned to me. Smoke without fire. It had irked me all week. Too obvious, too idiomatic. Until I recalled its second definition. The deliberate misdirection. A decoy. A suggestion of guilt where there was none. The stubs in the tray were menthol. Filtered. Margaret wore dentures. She couldn't have smoked them. And Lister didn't know they were there at all, which meant someone else had placed them. Not to mark a habit, but to mark a scene. It was staged. The scarf, the ashtray, the entire room. Someone was writing an ending. Not to the story, to the memory. Lister hadn't killed Margaret, but someone had wanted us to think he had. And somewhere in all that careful composition, the true motive still flickered in the margins. Not rage, not fear, not even revenge, but regret. The kind Oxford hides better than any place I've ever known. You begin, as always, by retracing. Not the steps, but the silences between them. The things that were nearly said. The edges of conversations where truth curled like paper near a flame. The ashtray. I see it again. Cold porcelain. Heavy in the palm, like something half-ceremonial. And the stubs, neatly aligned, identical, too precise to be carelessness, too conspicuous to be habit. Smoke without fire, yes, but also perhaps fire without witness. It had been Helena Vale, of course. Not a smoker, not in the clinical sense, but she understood symbols. She taught Sappho. After all, she knew the weight of a gesture, a torn page, a line unfinished, a room arranged just so. The ashtray was a message, not to us, to Margaret. A sign, I think, of recognition, or maybe protection. Decades ago, Margaret had vanished from the college's memory, not from its soil. She'd cleaned the floors she once walked with. Promise, dusted the books that might have borne her name, and kept secrets. Not because she was afraid of what would happen if they surfaced, but because someone else was. Helena had once tried to intervene. But Oxford, even in its kindness, is a cautious place. Protect the reputation. Shield the name. Let the fire pass. So long as there's no visible smoke. And Charles Valentine, Greaves, scholar, archivist, keeper of misremembered things. He had more than theory to present. Margaret had uncovered falsified sources, a student expelled to conceal it, a tangled affair between Dawn and pupil. And then, the collapse, quiet, clerical, cruel. She'd been told to disappear. But people don't vanish neatly. They return in corners, in council flats, in the margins of rare books. The letter to CV sat in my coat pocket like a stone. Written in Margaret's handwriting, slanted and certain. She'd addressed it not with fury, but with formality. As if trying to summon a man who had once existed but no longer answered by that name. You never replied, I said. No. He said. You read it. He nodded. Opera played faintly in the background, something aching in Italian. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for a glass he didn't drink from. She jumped, he said. I didn't push her, but you were there. Yes. And did nothing. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, the way one might in a cathedral or a confessional. What would you have done, Inspector? He asked. 30 years of it. The weight, the silence, one wrong truth, and everything collapses. The truth doesn't collapse things, I said. It reveals how badly built they were to begin with. He laughed. Not mockery, something lonelier. I should have been braver, he said. I thought I'd grown old. Turns out I was just tired. I left him there. Among the shelves, the opera still playing, a man already buried by memory. Later, I walked the quad. Rain had begun again. Soft, indecisive. The stone glistened like old teeth. Somewhere, leaves fell from the ash tree. I watched them drift. Smoke, without fire. The clue had seemed trivial at first. Now it rang with something else entirely. She hadn't been killed, not with hands, but with years, with forgettings, with the long, slow theft of selfhood. And that, too, is murder. Lewis asked me later what would happen to them. Vale, Greaves, Lister. I told him I didn't know. Oxford protects its own, but the truth was simpler. They would go on, differently, unspokenly, with a kind of reverence for what they'd destroyed. And Margaret, she left no heirs, no accolades, only annotations in the margins. A life lived in footnotes, but some footnotes I think matter more than the text. The inquest passed like a late lecture, sparsely attended, overly polite, and determined not to feel too much. The verdict, inconclusive. Suicide, a tidy conclusion for those who required one. Margaret Clennell, occupation cleaner, cause of death, voluntary submersion, nothing criminal, nothing scandalous. Nothing. I listened without speaking, watched without looking. The coroner's tone was level, the statements brief. No mention of the torn manuscript, or the false confession, or the life misplaced so elegantly it was almost an art. The college, for its part, adjusted with that quiet elasticity unique to old institutions. Her name was removed from the maintenance rota, her personnel files sealed, then quietly shredded. The bursar's report made no mention of the change in will. The staff bulletin thanked her for long and loyal service. No one asked what that service had once been. Aaron Lister vanished again. No forwarding address, no final word. I imagined him dissolving into some second-hand bookshop in Manchester or Madrid, surrounded by verse and the stale smell of damp coats. His role, whatever it had truly been, felt like punctuation, not the sentence itself. Helena Vale left a typed letter on the master's desk and walked out of the college gate at 6:30, one Thursday. I stood at my window and watched her pause just once beneath the ash tree. She didn't look up, just lingered a moment, then left. She had loved Margaret, I think. Not with ease, not with outcome, but with a fidelity only guilt can sustain. Greaves remained. Of course he did. Men like him always do. His lectures resumed, quieter now. He referred less to Petrarch, more often to paleography. His hands trembled slightly when turning pages. I watched him once in the SER, setting a book down with unexpected gentleness, The silence around him was not reverent, it was avoidance. And me? I stayed longer than I should have, lingering over details long cold. The crossword, abandoned for days, now waited folded on the bench beside me. I filled in the penultimate clue, without effort, epitaph, and then the last one. Where the truth lies. I hesitated. The phrasing amused me. In that way riddles do when they pretend to be profound. Then, slowly, almost without thinking, I wrote under silence. There was no pleasure in solving it, only a sense of arrival, as if I'd come home to an empty house and found all the lights had been left on. I folded the paper, tucked it into my coat. Petals had begun to fall from the late blooming cherry. They drifted across the flagstones like delicate debris, gathering at the foot of the bench where Margaret once sat, humming something operatic beneath her breath. No plaque, no memory, no elegy, but I remember her, the opera, in the dust. The scholarship hidden under bleach. The woman who asked for nothing and gave everything but her silence. Oxford is full of ghosts. They wear gowns. Quote Virgil, pass unnoticed through centuries. Margaret will never have a portrait on the wall. But in the hush between lectures, in the rustle of petals over stone, I sometimes hear her, not loudly, not clearly, but enough. The end.